Familial Acts of Violence and Subsequent Repercussions by Kyle Benegas. Family violence is found in the United States today in every form, whether that is child or spousal abuse, or animal and elder abuse. You must take many different factors into consideration. First, there is family abuse all over the world. However, the United States has been, and will continue to be, one of the world's leaders in this regard. This socially places us, as United States citizens, on a lower rung than we would have been at before, globally speaking. Cognitively speaking, this must be one of the most life-changing experiences that one could endure. I believe that if you were to be in a bad enough position, this could completely turn your life around towards the wrong path. Currently, although the numbers have decreased dramatically because of the coronavirus and its effect on our option to leave our homes, families and relatives are being essentially forced into spending time with each other. This would lead into complications and disagreements between family members, and then the emotional and verbal abuse will start. It will usually end in a physical altercation, and this possibility has raised from the incredibly low 7% pre-pandemic results to the post-pandemic result of 44%, according to the US Census results of 2020. So, currently, things are not going well for many. It was not until the early 1900s that domestic abuse was commonly known in the United States, but was kept under a veil, labeled a private family affair. In the 60s United States, the abuse became more apparent, and small movements of women, children, and abused people started trying to stand up for themselves and deny their once-lived subservient lifestyles and abuse cycles. Those who have gotten away with doing these heinous acts are the ones who benefited in the moment perhaps, but inflicting this sort of damage has the same effect of the person who is dealing the blows. I can imagine them perpetuating the cycle that their elders did to them, and so on. This must mean that unintentionally, I would assume, you are now solidifying the continued cycle of abuse that past generations have continued, and stopping upper generational mobility. For example, if a boy was to grow up watching his mother be beaten up by all of her boyfriends or her husband, then he would first learn that this was a normal thing, and second, copy and resemble that behavior in his adult life. This would lead to criminal charges, and, in the worst case scenario, a life behind bars. One major factor that no one talks about is all the elder abuse that happens daily. For instance, there have been many news stories and articles related to elder abuse. One case in particular focuses on a 90-year-old woman and how she is locked and lives in an outhouse-like shed in the back of a house in the middle of the woods and is treated like a dog. Her Social Security check was being collected and used by her family every month, while she was being milked dry of her last resources and life. She ended up being found dead, tied up in the shed, and the family was persecuted. I cannot believe that something this cruel would happen in our modern society. However, this reveals an underlying unspoken sector about a group of people vulnerable to bad family members. As a personal experience, my grandmother was physically and verbally mistreated by my grandfather daily, and it was overlooked by the family, as well as everyone that they ever knew, because they were raised in a society that those types of things were seen as the regular daily lives of millions, and were made lighter than the situation actually was. Cognitively speaking, everyone was groomed to deem that these acts of abuse as the norm, so they saw nothing out of place. However, this tradition died out with my grandparents, at least in my family, because my parents, or general family members far and wide, never really had any sorts of physical altercations, although verbal and emotional abuse were absolutely on the table at all times. Thankfully, in my personal experience, I do not have a history of traumatic abusive memories, but the emotional and cognitive familial abuse sets in early in life. In my opinion, emotional abuse is the worst type of abuse. However, abuse forms are usually combined, whether it is physical and emotional, cognitive and emotional, or other different types of variations. Usually, the victim will leave the interaction with some sort of emotional scars and/or trauma/resentment. And this will change their personal perspective about life and how they will conduct themselves in regular society and other social situations. This could be detrimental to one's success in life, so it is best to try to avoid conflict whenever possible. One modern major factor that must be adding to the frequency of the abuse is the LGBTQ+ movement and social influencers like Donald Trump, who promote misogyny and bigotry. With factors like these coming into play, it only leaves more room for judgment, discrimination, and overall abuse, being as these sorts of people don't really fit into the confines of society and that the mass majority sees fit. In turn, this makes the LGBTQ plus community a discriminated group around the United States and the world. With these modern people come modern cases of abuse. Although tensions have gotten much less physical, the emotional, spiritual, and cognitive damage and abuse has been dramatically increased. For instance, I read an article about how there is verbal and cognitive abuse in about 25% of LGBTQ plus relationships across the United States. This shows that regardless of your gender identity, you have to accept the fact that abuse is alive and well. So this is a great motivation to wait to choose that right partner for you and to not rush into unknown territory. This also means that these people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community have been greatly affected by abuse, most likely due to their sexual orientation. So there is a common result amid of all of this. More likely than not, if you are abusive, you have been abused. Although it is not always the case for most, it sadly is. These individuals could get rehab, or they could try to solve things themselves, but the cognitive damage is already done. Thus, this abuse often had the abused running for another form of solace, because they couldn't trust their families anymore. This could have led them to the LGBTQ plus community, therefore altering what they would have done if they weren't damaged and abused. In relation with that, if a young boy goes through emotional and physical abuse from his youth, it will become a common theme in his life and become a clear option in his young developing mind to stop or diffuse a conflict. In order to solve his problems in the future, he will most likely resort to violence or abusing someone before trying to do a more socially acceptable tactic. This only makes sense as he was raised and groomed in this environment, and just like if a child were to be raised in a loving, abuse-free home, then he or she would most likely not result or act out in any form of abusive manner when dealing with familial conundrums in their future lives. The main problem is that most people above the age of 30, US Census results 2020, most likely went through some type of familial abuse, as it was a common happening that went on in households across the United States before the 1970s and 80s. Clearly, now we can see what kinds of problems familial abuse brings to the table. Let's remove the personal aspect and talk about the grand scheme of things. Culturally speaking, abuse has been deeply embedded within our country's seams. Not only was abuse of any form disregarded for most of our existence, but child abuse was a common factor in the 19th century, being as, just like for women, there were no legal protections for these children. This basically meant that whatever was to happen happened without the repercussions, and was seen as something normal, as it was for all forms of abuse. This was majorly influenced by our parents, being as their parents taught them the same thing, and so on. Something happened when World War II ended, because all those soldiers coming back with PTSD and shell shock from the wars came home and gave all those problems and abuse that they had to deal with to their families, whether it was direct or indirect. Unfortunately, these babies that were born from these silent generation World War II and World War I participants had it the worst in the recent decade, being as they had to directly deal with the trauma of war through their parents. This ended up transmitting into popular culture, and violence of all types was now being perpetuated through all forms of media, from radio to television. With everyone nowadays realizing all the tragedies that were being committed for so long, most abuse cases will come to light. There have been many different approaches to handling domestic and familial abuse. On the micro scale, there have been many improvements made, such as going to couples counseling, meditation, and talking through our problems, based on the sociological imagination, in order to fully address and solve the problem of familial or domestic abuse. We must try to see the perspective of everyone involved. Quite literally, those who are currently committing abusive acts learned it while growing up, whether that was directly through their elders to them, or indirectly, like witnessing it happen to family members in person, or seeing it as a common motif on TV or other media. A famous example is the famous cartoon Tom and Jerry, and how they mistreat each other physically, beating each other and verbally offending each other. It wasn't until the late 80s that domestic abuse was taken as a serious criminal act and was punishable by law in the United States. This makes me question the integrity of our criminal justice systems, as well as open my eyes to the extremely unequal society that we currently live in. On the macro scale, there have been women's rights activists and other forms of protest that have influenced enough of the vast population to cause legislative change, making abuse punishable by law. This in addition to modernizing society, aka changing antiquated perceptions about abuse in the family, and an overall effort to try to get those abused people or children to speak up or tell someone who can help, like a teacher for instance, or a peer, as there are many people who want to help nowadays. I feel like there is one major strategy that can promote social change that we can utilize immediately. I have personally found that these acts of aggression end up as built-up testosterone that was suddenly released, and I usually use that spurt of energy towards some push-ups or some squats. Or I just start running around out of my front door and around the block. By using this sudden energy for something productive, you can act accordingly and respond pragmatically to the situation at hand. Although this may not work for everyone, it will work for many. And hey, there is always the option to go for a more intimately relaxing medical approach, if you know what I mean. However, this is not always the right option, so if you were able to take different courses of action when dealing with abuse and report it instead of reacting back to it, then perhaps you could save yourself a lot of trouble. This could also lead to a criminally mandatory stay in jail if you are committed of abuse. I bet that would change some minds of possible abusers. Not only would you reduce the number of women and child abuse that an individual can be causing, but you would be leading by example and showing the future and current generations that you always have the option of doing something to stop perpetuating this cycle of abuse throughout your family's generations. More simply stated, this growing up being socialized by your family/close interactions is called your primary socialization, because you learn foundational aspects of being socialized, like speaking, manners, etc. This is supposed to prepare you for receiving the information and should aid you in your future effort to immerse into society and to interact with others on a broader scale. This is supposed to be a seamless transition. However, if a child is brought into their secondary socialization without a proper, safe and secure, non-abusive primary socialization, the child will not behave accordingly and perhaps act differently and aggressively towards their peers or role models. This will only lead into a life of being physical or abusive in any form in order to get what they want. Those who take this baggage into their secondary socialization process will develop differently than others and have less normal behaviors. It is up to those public figures like teachers and role models to try to aid in these sorts of things by publishing and endorsing good behaviors and wholesome intentions, rather than violence and abuse. Although it is less spoken about, it is necessary to mention sexual abuse and how it can affect one cognitively, in addition to damaging one's emotional and physical attributes. This is one of the most impactful, if not the most impactful, forms of abuse that there is, being as this sort of abuse could break your spirit and destroy any sense of personal control that you would have had before. In addition, it affects your overall concept of trust, which generates, in many cases, a sense of hopelessness that can result in isolation and complete withdrawal from society. Abuse is bad in all forms, as it represents that boundary that must be protected in order to accomplish emotional and spiritual homeostasis. Other factors include, but are not limited to, environmental factors and lack of access, such as lack of employment or financial stability, etc. In order to make sexual abuse a more widely spoken about subject, we need to call out the acts of abuse and bring them to the law for the aggressor to not have that moment or chance to commit another heinous violent act, if you were to tell them yourself. Anyone can be sexually abused by their family members, no matter if you are a man, woman, child, or a member of the LGBTQ+ community. You are vulnerable. Spousal abuse is also a big part of the problem and can destroy a person's psyche. It is portrayed as something that you should do and want to do in pop culture and music, but the problem is that abuse is so commonly spoken about that it is not taken as a taboo anymore. For example, late rapper Pop Smoke has many misogynistic and abusive songs, with one specifically stating, "Just lower your tone because you could get hit," referring to his girlfriend or counterpart at the time. With these types of songs going around the media and being praised, it is no wonder why there are so many cases of blatant abuse in the case of celebrities. We are taught to follow the steps of celebrities and to look up to them as role models. However, with role models like these, I think we should try to keep our own thoughts and opinions and act on them, and not be followers. Another major widespread happening in between admired celebrities was with Chris Brown and Rihanna, when he physically abused her with his punches and with his words, cognitively, physically, and emotionally scarring her. In their case, however, Rihanna was physically and verbally abusive first. Although they broke up and Chris reported himself to the police the next day, it does not take away the fact that it still happened. And of course, it could be the other way around, with a woman or girlfriend, wife, spouse being the aggressor in the relationship. A commonly known example could be with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, where although she was the supposed major abuser, she got away with it in the courts because she is a woman, and women being physically abusive matters less than males being physically abusive, which is simply not the case. Both sides can inflict the same amount of damage to one another, so it is best to try to talk through possibly abusive situations in order to maintain good relationships. All in all, I believe that we will only gain more abuse in the United States because with all the stressors and financial burdens that are coming along with the coronavirus, we are going to have to be tighter and stricter with our resources. To add to this, being socialized under the notion of past abuse will only negatively affect your social standing, and therefore your social skills will lack. In order to make a real attempt at stopping familial abuse and aiding in the cause, Z-Gen and other older but progressive members of other past generations, and all the future generations, can avoid being abusive to their children and spouses and teach them the right way to go about problems. Depending on the cultural aspects involved, there will be different beliefs and different customs. However, if we, as the United States citizens, would be able to lead by example, then I believe that we can really make a difference, not just in America, but in the whole world. Using the sociological imagination, one can choose to be empathetic and not abuse a family member. Being aware of your actions and how they could affect others in the long run could give you that missing perspective that you needed, therefore avoiding abuse of any kind from ever entering your life. If we were able to make a free, anonymous way for people to report familial abuse, then we would be able to get the abused the type of help that they actually need. Thank you for listening, and I hope you can take my words into consideration.